Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
On the evening when the fog turned the colour of watered claret, I was summoned from my chair at Baker Street by a brisk rap upon the door and the unmistakable tread of Inspector Lestrade upon the stair. The lamps along the thoroughfare showed only as dull discs in a vapour thick enough to muffle a man's footfall, and the whole of London seemed steeped in a damp that carried with it the faint odour of coal smoke and wet rope from the river. Holmes, who had been languidly drawing the bow across his violin, laid the instrument aside with a flicker of interest that I have observed when fate brings him an opponent worthy of his peculiar gifts. "You have timed your visit to a minute, Inspector," said Holmes, indicating the hearth. "Another quarter of an hour of that fog and Baker Street would have been surrendered to the sea." Lestrade's hat and shoulders were beaded with moisture. He set both upon the table without ceremony and stood for a moment to warm his hands, though his eyes never left Holmes's face. I saw at once the tension in his mouth. A man of Lestrade's experience does not cross London on a night like this for a trifle. "It is a bad business, Mr. Holmes," he said. "One that will set the papers scribbling and gentlemen's clubs buzzing by breakfast. We have a dead man, no name as yet, found at the edge of the Adelphi stairs in this infernal fog. And there is the colour of the thing. By heaven, I don't mean the fog, though that's curious enough. The fellow's shirt front is crimson as a flag, and yet there is scarcely any blood to be had of it." Holmes's fingers, which had been idly steepled, separated and fell to his knees. The keen grey eyes brightened. "Crimson, you say, and no blood?" "Not a drop that one could swear to. The surgeon thought at first that we had another river case, a gentleman who stepped too near the lip and found the Thames, but the face is neither swollen nor watermarked. There is a bruise at the temple, a delicate one, as if given by, well, by something that had no right to be a weapon." "A gentleman?" Holmes asked, in that quiet tone by which he will draw the soul out of a witness. "You use the word with confidence." "He's not a dockhand at any rate," said Lestrade. "Even wet to the knees he is better turned out than I am. Fine worsted pearl studs, a good pair of leather gloves in his pocket, and the sort of boots my wages would not stretch to. No papers." The pockets had been felt, but not ripped. Neat fingers, Mr. Holmes. I'll say that for your man, whether he's our corpse or our culprit. Holmes leaned forward and stretched his hand. "The gloves." Lestrade, who is long used to such commands, produced a small parcel wrapped in his own handkerchief. Holmes took it, lifted the edge to his nostrils, and gave a brief, satisfied sniff that would have seemed theatrical in any other man. He set the parcel upon the mantel and returned his gaze to the inspector. "You mentioned the colour," Holmes said. "Crimson. To what extent?" "Enough that any cabman who saw him carried under a lantern would tell the tale at his yard for a week. The shirt front, as I said, the cuffs, the inside of the collar, and, this is the worst of it, the fog all about him at the river stairs looked red, as if a theatre had loosed its lamps into it." Holmes's eyes half closed. "A fog stained by light or stained by substance?" "Stained by, bless me, Mr. Holmes, how should I know?" Lestrade snapped, though without malice. The men swore that for a yard or two around him the mist was tinted. It's night, and there are lamps, and the river throws up every sort of trickery. Holmes rose. The languor of the early evening dropped from him as a cloak. "And where is he now?" "At the station off the Strand. I thought—" "Well, you see what I thought." "You thought correctly," said Holmes. "Watson, your coat, a river staircase, a dead man in evening dress, a fog with a colour, and a bruise that is not quite a bruise. We would be poor servants to our curiosity if we sat by the fire. Within a quarter of an hour we were in a cab, the horse stepping carefully through a murk that hung in sheets, so dense that the small bead of our lamp seemed to press against it like a thumb against velvet. The driver's voice was a disembodied thing in the night. Beside me, Holmes was quiet, the keen lines of his profile carved by the occasional glow of a street lantern. He had pulled his collar high, and his gloved fingers tapped once upon the door, then were still. "You were struck by the colour," I ventured. "I am struck, Watson, by what people call colour in a city of smoke," said he. "To hear of a fog tinged crimson is to hear of a canvas prepared by some human hand. The Thames, the stairs, the lamps, the man, each plays a part. I should like to see the stage before the scene is struck." At the little station off the Strand, Lestrade led us through a corridor that smelt of damp serge and lamp oil. In a narrow room beyond, upon a trestle, and with a sheet over him as carelessly as a waiter might cover a dish, lay the man who had come out of the crimson fog. The sheet was folded back to the breastbone. I confess I shuddered, not at death itself, to which my medical practice had inured me, but at a peculiar, faintly sweet scent, like violets left too long in a drawer. The front of the white shirt was, as Lestrade had said, stained a vivid red, too bright for old blood and too uniform for new. The colour had run into the weave and dried in patches that reminded me, incongruously, of the watered patterns one sees on fashionable ribbons. Holmes took no note of my reaction. He bent low, his face a pale plain above the stillness. He sniffed lightly, held the air in his lungs, and then released it through the corner of his mouth. He examined the hair, fair, neatly trimmed, the ear, the nails, and at last the throat. His touch was extraordinarily gentle. Presently he lifted the right hand, turning it palm up so that the light fell across the pads of the fingers. "A man who wrote little but handled paper often," he murmured, "and who used cologne, thinking it discreet. A creature of habit, yet vain enough to alter a habit for an occasion." "You knew him, then?" Lestrade asked. Holmes straightened. "I know what he is not. He is not a clerk, though he keeps a clerk's hours. He is not a sailor, though there is pitch in one seam of his left cuff. He dines with men who talk louder than they think. He is accustomed to theatre air. He has not been dead above 3 hours." "That last is the surgeon's opinion," said Lestrade, half grudging and half relieved. "Then your surgeon is a more observant man than his manner suggested. We shall quarrel on other points." Holmes's gaze went to the folded gloves on a nearby chair, the same pair Lestrade had surrendered in our rooms. He opened them now and slipped 2 fingers within, feeling at the seam as a moneylender might test a coin. Then he brought them again to his nose. I saw the slight lift of his eyebrow. "Inspector, did any man remark upon the odour in the room?" Lestrade sniffed, made a face, and shrugged. "I thought it was the lamp. Smells like a flower cellar gone to rot." "Violet," said Holmes, "but not violet. An imitation of something finer." He turned once more to the body, and I saw his expression sharpen. There, beneath the angle of the jaw and half hidden by the collar, was a faint mark, not wide enough to be a bruise from a blow, not sharp enough to be a cut. It was more as if a thin cord had kissed the flesh, then slid away. "Lestrade," Holmes said softly, "did your men search the river stairs thoroughly?" "We did," the inspector answered. "Found nothing but a bit of torn paper, soaked to pulp. We had it set aside on the off chance it might dry into scents." "Let us see your off chance." Lestrade fetched a saucer from a desk, on which lay a damp, dismal scrap, its fibres swollen like porridge. Holmes took it up with a penknife, laid it flat upon a blotter, and coaxed at it with a gentleness that would have done credit to a surgeon. As the edges spread, a faint trace of ink resolved itself into a loop and a stroke. "A letter?" I suggested. "A letter indeed," said Holmes. More letter than word. The tale is continental. The stroke is English, the ink is cheap, the paper is not. He set the scrap down and turned again to the corpse. From the man's waistcoat pocket he drew a small chain, snapped at the middle. "A watch," said Lestrade quickly. "Gone." "A watch, yes," Holmes agreed. "But see the snap. Not torn by violence alone. A practised hand knows where to worry a chain. Your thief has the habit of a particular theft." "A pickpocket?" "Pickpockets do not carry scent of this. Imitation upon their gloves, nor do they leash a man with a filament thin as a violin string. No, Inspector, this is a gentler profession at work." He fell silent and stood with his head bowed as if in prayer. When he raised it, his eyes were cold and distant. "Watson," he said, "you observed the stain upon the shirt front. Pray take a drop of water from that pitcher and touch it to the edge." I did as he asked. The red brightened, then bled outward a fraction, with a faint bloom that suggested not clotting but solution. Holmes's nostrils flared. "Not blood," he said. "Or rather not merely blood. A preparation with a base, that is, no, I shall not commit myself. The fog will tell me more than this room." "The fog?" Lestrade stared. "Yes, Inspector. The city has given us a theatre, and it is not my habit to ignore the stage directions. You will keep the body here and permit no one to handle it further. I shall require access to the Adelphi stairs precisely as they were found, and I must have word sent to a gentleman in Covent Garden who will let me stand upon his roof. There is an answer hanging in the air of London tonight, and I intend to take it down." Lestrade gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Upon my word, Mr. Holmes, you are the only man I know who takes the weather as evidence." Holmes reached for his coat. "Weather, Inspector, is only the chemistry of the sky. When men meddle with chemistry, they leave fingerprints where they think themselves untouchable. Come, Watson, the Thames keeps its counsel for those who listen." And so it was that we went out again into the night, where the fog had indeed a faint, uncanny tint, and the lamps made small, trembling islands upon a crimson sea. I confess that a chill took me then which the coat could not master. There is a certain dread that comes not from what one sees, but from what one believes one has seen and cannot prove. Holmes walked on ahead, a lean, dark mast cutting the vapour, and I followed, notebook in my pocket, and a question beating at my temples. What strange hand had painted the very air of London red, and to what purpose had it chosen a gentleman's throat for its frame? We found the Strand like a tunnel reversed, walls of vapour and a roof of darkness, rents where lamps thrust through. At the top of the Adelphi stairs the fog pooled like broth, luminous and touched with that tint Lestrade had described. Holmes paused upon the first step, removed a glove, touched the rail, and smelt his fingertip. "Salt," he murmured, "but not river salt alone. There is a binder here that clings to metal better than Thames spray." Lestrade called for a bull's-eye. Holmes forbade it. "No bright light," he said. "We must observe the stage as the scene was set." We descended. The river, hidden from sight, declared itself by odour and by a dull slap upon the lower steps. Holmes halted at the third from the bottom. His boot lifted a thread, so fine I might have taken it for a flaw in the air. He pinched it, and it sang faintly, the ghost of a note. "Violin E drawn through wax," he observed. "See how it is fastened. A slip knot round the baluster, the other end frayed by haste. There is the kiss it left on our gentleman's neck." Lestrade bent until his knees creaked. "By the powers," he muttered. "So he was seized here?" "Seized, controlled, and presented to something else," said Holmes. "Observe the heel marks, 2 men, one guiding, one resisting. The leader wore a narrow boot with a French lift, the other a broader English last. The steps have been wiped with a cloth. He feared prints more than splashes. Holmes crouched near the rail. Caught upon a rivet lay a scrap of fabric. He teased it free and spread it on his cuff. Even in that poor light it showed a delicate weave, white, faintly tinted toward rose. "Stage gauze," said he, "from a dancer's skirt or a theatre veil. I think the crimson fog was born of a powder fixed to such stuff and shaken here in cloud." "A theatre?" Lestrade bristled. "Then we shall rattle half the chorus of the Strand." "Not half," Holmes returned. "A particular house. I asked you for a roof. The air may tell us which." He paced round the head of the stairs, nose lifted. To the west the fog was its common dun. To the east it wore a winey bloom. Holmes traced that tint across an alley and up toward the backs of buildings. "Up," he said. "The powder is light. What settled here is a fraction of what was loosed above." We cut behind a coffee stall, through a mews, and by a yard to an iron stair that yielded to Holmes. We climbed until the fog thinned. On the roof he stood still, lifted his arm, and drew a line. "Do you mark it, Watson?" "The colour is strongest where the current bends about that cupola. It comes from behind it. Between us and that source is a lane. What stands beyond the lane?" "The Corinthian," I ventured. "A music hall." "Precisely. The Corinthian prides itself on novel effects. I shall be unsurprised if tonight's novelty was a crimson cloud over the river. Consider our victim. Evening dress, theatre air upon his clothes, cheap violet imitation masking a coarser smell. He was drawn from that house to the stair by one who knows these roofs." "And the motive?" Lestrade demanded. "Robbery? His watch was taken." "A garnish to mislead. What is stolen to distract may yet be returned. The true object lies not in his pockets but in his person. He was used as a screen." "Screen?" I echoed. "A human body is an excellent surface for a volatile preparation, a shove, a feigned stumble, a filament at the throat to command obedience, then a shake of gauze. The fog becomes a colour, a message for one pair of eyes upon the river. Our dead man was a lantern." "A signal for whom?" said Lestrade. "For a boat," Holmes replied. "It will have hugged the shadow. You will send to the water police for every craft reported within the hour. Meanwhile I shall present myself at the Corinthian as an indolent gentleman whose curiosity outruns his manners. Watson, you shall be my respectability." "And I?" Lestrade growled. "You," said Holmes, "will prevent every newspaper in London from announcing that the weather has been murdered." We regained the street and took a cab east. Holmes leaned forward. "Note, Watson," he said, "how the scent on the stair was sweet but false. There is a preparation used behind the footlights to drown less agreeable odours. A cheap counterfeit leaves that cloying trace. Our gauze handler has lived in the wings." "And the cord?" "A musician's assistant would have it to hand, yet the knot is theatrical rather than musical. It secures a veil before a quick change, swift to set, swifter to loose. We shall find, I think, a lady who is no lady, or a gentleman who plays one too well." Lestrade gave a laugh. "And if your playhouse yields nothing?" "Then we have the river," Holmes answered. "Before dawn the stage may give us its curtain line, and perhaps its corpse." The cab left us before the Corinthian's glowing facade, where lamps shone hazily through the fog, casting ghostly halos upon the slick cobblestones. Music and laughter drifted out in bursts as the doors opened to admit latecomers, though the mist swallowed the sound almost as quickly as it escaped. Holmes adjusted his collar and strode forward with a gait that was suddenly languid, as if he had all the time in the world. He had assumed the manner of an idle patron, indifferent yet curious, while I was left to provide the air of sober respectability that would smooth his entrance. Inside, the Corinthian was alive with heat and perfume, the haze of cigars hanging thick beneath chandeliers that trembled faintly with every step of the orchestra's rhythm. Gilded mirrors reflected the swirl of feathers, jewels, and sequined bodices, giving the impression of a hall doubled in size and glitter. Holmes's keen eyes, however, did not linger on the stage where a comic song was in progress, but flitted to the wings, the curtains, and the mechanics behind the show. His hand brushed my sleeve, the faintest signal, and I understood. Observe, but do not betray the direction of his interest. We secured a table near the rear, half in shadow, and Holmes ordered nothing more than a glass of soda water. He leaned back, watching the stage with outward detachment, though I could see his gaze fix sharply whenever a dancer swept past with skirts that caught the lamplight. Presently, a troop of ladies emerged, their gauzy costumes pale enough to seem almost insubstantial in the glare. When they spun, faint motes clung to the air, not unlike the bloom of colour we had seen outside. Holmes's eyes narrowed at once. "There, Watson," he whispered as the applause rang out. "Observe the gauze. See the powder shaken loose by the motion of the skirts? It clings in the air, heavy for a moment before it vanishes. Imagine such substance loosed in the night, upon damp fog, with a man as its central figure." "You believe the crimson fog was engineered here?" I said softly. "I believe it was conceived here and executed by one who has access to both costume and chemistry." He drummed his fingers once against the table. "The art of stagecraft is the art of deception, Watson. Smoke, mirrors, powders, and paints. Who better than a theatre hand to tint a London fog?" At that moment, a tall, severe gentleman in black appeared at the side of the hall, watching the performance with an air of proprietorship. His sharp nose and thin lips gave him a hawk-like cast, and his presence commanded as much attention as the performers themselves. Holmes's gaze followed him without a blink. "That is Mr. Mortimer Crail," I murmured, recalling the name. "The owner of the Corinthian." Holmes inclined his head. "A man whose purse depends upon astonishment. If a fog could be coloured for spectacle, it would be his to sell. Yet the manner of last night was not meant for applause, it was meant for secrecy." When the performance ended and the audience bustled toward refreshment, Holmes rose as if aimlessly stretching his legs. I accompanied him, noting how his route led us toward the stage door rather than the bar. A portly doorman moved to block our path, but Holmes, with that mixture of arrogance and suavity that so often carried him past barriers, drew out a visiting card and presented it with a half-smile. "I am Henry Armitage of Oxford," he announced with perfect nonchalance, "seeking material for a small paper on stagecraft. My friend Dr. Watson assists me. A moment with one of your costumiers would be of inestimable value." The doorman, bewildered but impressed by Holmes's confidence, hesitated only briefly before allowing us through. We found ourselves in the dim corridor behind the stage, where the air was thick with grease paint and powder. Seamstresses moved to and fro with armfuls of fabric, and actors, still in half costume, lounged against the walls smoking. Holmes's eyes darted from face to face, missing nothing. He paused near a costume rack where gauzy veils hung in delicate folds. Running his fingers lightly over the fabric, he brushed up a faint dust that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. He brought it close to his nose, inhaled, and nodded with grim satisfaction. "The same binder as upon the stair rail," he whispered. "And note the colour, Watson, an aniline dye, bright and artificial. It clings unnaturally, and when mixed with damp it blooms like wine." At that moment, a slender figure approached, carrying a tray of make-up pots. She was a young woman, dark-haired, her eyes quick but wary. Holmes intercepted her gently, bowing as though she were a duchess. "Miss," he said. "A thousand pardons. This veil, tell me, what powder do you use upon it?" The girl started, clutching her tray. "Why, sir, nothing but a common dust to catch the light. I don't mix it. Mr. Felix does, in the paint room. He says it makes the air sparkle." Felix? Holmes's tone was mild, but I caught the keen interest beneath it. "The stage painter," she said, lowering her voice. "But he frightens me, sir. He comes and goes at odd hours, and last night he quarrelled with a gentleman at the side door. I heard raised voices, and then they both vanished into the fog." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "You have been most helpful." He pressed a shilling into her hand, and she darted off with a grateful curtsy. Lestrade, who had followed us in, muttered under his breath, "Felix, a foreign-sounding name. I'll wager he's the one who led our man to the stairs." Holmes said nothing at first. He had plucked one of the gauzy veils from the rack, and now held it close to the lamp. The faint crimson shimmer in the folds was unmistakable. "Our puzzle sharpens," Holmes murmured. "A painter with access to chemicals, quarrelling with our victim, and a theatre effect that can turn London's fog into a signal fire. The question, Watson, is not how it was done. We have the means before us, but why?" He let the veil fall back into place and turned toward the exit with sudden energy. "Come, the paint room will tell us more than idle chatter." We followed him deeper into the warren of corridors, the din of the audience fading behind us. Somewhere beyond, a door closed softly, and footsteps retreated into silence. Holmes quickened his pace, his expression sharpening into the cold mask I had seen only when the chase was truly underway. The crimson fog, the corpse, the quarrel. All were threads now drawn tight in his mind, converging toward a knot that I feared might prove darker than either Lestrade or I yet imagined. The paint room lay at the far end of a corridor, where the boards sagged and the smell of turpentine grew sharp enough to sting the nose. Holmes pushed the door open without ceremony. The chamber was low-ceilinged, lit by a single swinging lamp, and cluttered with pots of colour, brushes, and stage backdrops rolled against the walls like sleeping giants. The air was thick with pigments, earthy and chemical alike, and on one bench lay several shallow trays, each lined with gauze that bore the faint residue of a crimson dust. Holmes moved toward them at once, while Lestrade shut the door behind us and muttered something about warrants. Holmes ignored him. With the delicacy of a surgeon, he drew a small paper envelope from his pocket and scooped a portion of the residue into it. He held the tray beneath the light, then touched a finger to the surface and let the powder bloom across his fingertip. "Aniline dye, strengthened with a mordant," he murmured. "Too harsh for fabric, too fleeting for paint. But in the air!" He blew gently, and the dust hung for a moment in a faint crimson haze before dispersing. "Yes, precisely the effect seen at the river. Our Mr. Felix is an artist of atmospheres." Lestrade bent low to peer at the tray. "A theatre trick, no doubt, but what's that to do with murder?" Holmes gave a half-smile. "The trick is nothing. The choice of stage is everything. A man was led into the fog at precisely the spot where this powder had been released, and he was made to stand as its centerpiece. You ask the purpose? To signal. To whom and for what, we have yet to learn." As he spoke, his eyes caught on a splintered chair at the corner of the room. Across its back was a faint smear, darker than the dust, a bruise of colour. Holmes crouched, scraped a fleck with his penknife, and smelt it. His expression sharpened. "Watson," he said, "do you perceive it?" I bent close. The odour was faintly sweet, floral yet cloying, the same scent that had hung over the body in the station house. The violet perfume. Exactly. Our victim was here. He either sat or was thrust down upon this chair. He left his trace when the quarrel occurred." At that, Lestrade gave a low whistle. "Then the girl was right. He met Felix here. They quarrelled, and one ended up dead by the river." Holmes rose swiftly, his eyes darting about the room with restless precision. He examined the brushes, the smudges upon the wall, the stains on the boards. At last he paused at a coat hung behind the door, a threadbare thing with paint on every cuff. In the pocket he found a length of fine cord, waxed and looped at one end with the very knot we had seen imprinted upon the victim's neck. Holmes held it aloft for Lestrade to see. "There is your instrument," he said. "Felix handled it with practised ease. Yet you will note, Inspector, that our painter has not been careless. He left no purse, no papers, nothing to mark his hand but this, an oversight born of haste." Lestrade's face darkened. "He won't get far. I'll have the doors closed and the men on him in minutes." But Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet. If you startle him, he will vanish into the alleys and perhaps out of England itself. Better to let him think himself safe. We require more than a cord and some powder. We require the why. Without motive, the case is but half a picture." At that moment, the faint sound of a footstep echoed from the passage outside. Holmes signalled for silence. The latch turned and the door creaked open. A thin, stooping man entered, his hair wild, his hands stained with pigment to the nails. He halted at once upon seeing us, his eyes narrowing like a fox trapped in a snare. "Mr. Felix, I presume?" Holmes said coolly. The man's gaze darted to the trays, then to the coat where the cord had hung. His lips moved as if to frame a denial, but no sound came. He took a step backward. Lestrade lunged, but Holmes caught his sleeve, restraining him. "Not now," Holmes whispered. "Let him go." And go he did, vanishing down the corridor with astonishing speed. Lestrade swore under his breath. "You've let the devil slip, Holmes." "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "I have loosed him upon a leash of my own making. He will return to his master, for such men do not act alone. Watch him closely, and he will lead us to the heart of the conspiracy." We left the paint room soon after, Lestrade grumbling, but unable to conceal his grudging respect. Outside, the fog pressed close once more, though the theatre lamps fought valiantly against it. Holmes paused beneath one flickering gaslight, his gaze fixed on the dark street beyond. "Watson," he said, his voice low and intent, "did you mark the fear in Felix's eyes? That was not the fear of discovery alone. He is the tool of another, and he knows the price of failure. There is more here than a quarrel and a cord." We followed Holmes back toward Baker Street, the fog curling about our wheels like smoke from some vast, unseen fire. He spoke little on the journey, though I could see his mind was in furious motion. Once he muttered half to himself, "A signal in crimson, a man made into a lantern, a painter who fears his own art. The river is but the stage. What lies beyond must be the drama itself." When we reached our rooms, Holmes went at once to his desk and spread the envelope of powder across a slip of glass. He added a drop of reagent from a vial, and the crimson hue dissolved into a deeper stain that clung stubbornly to the surface. "There," he said, satisfaction in his tone. "A mixture bound with bichromate, a costly preparation for a mere stage trick. Someone has spent handsomely for this deception." "And to what end?" I asked. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers, his eyes half closed. "That, Watson, is the question that will decide whether our victim was a random pawn or the centre of a web too vast for us yet to see. Tomorrow we must learn who he was, for a man is not murdered by accident in the crimson fog of London." His words hung in the air, and as the fire crackled low in the grate, I felt the weight of the mystery deepen, each clue tightening its hold like the coils of a noose we had only just begun to perceive. The next morning broke with the same heavy fog lingering over London, though the pale light of day gave it the hue of watered chalk rather than crimson. Holmes had scarcely slept. I found him at the breakfast table, the untouched plate of eggs pushed aside in favour of a stack of newspapers and a scatter of notes in his hand. His pipe lay smoking on the mantel, and his eyes, sharp and restless, betrayed a mind that had worked through the night. "You see, Watson," he began, holding up a sheet from the Morning Post. "They have not yet connected the murder to the theatre. The press speaks only of a gentleman found dead by the river in mysterious fog, though rumour makes him everything from a foreign envoy to a ruined gambler. Scotland Yard keeps its silence, as I instructed Lestrade. That gives us 1 day's grace before the clamour begins." "And what do we know of the man himself?" I asked, pouring coffee and seating myself opposite him. Holmes's fingers tapped the newspaper. "Very little. No papers were found upon him, but I have written to the tailors who mark their wares with that peculiar stitch in the lining. By this afternoon we shall know to whom they sold that suit. In the meantime, I have another path." He rose abruptly, took his violin case from the corner, and began fitting the instrument together. It puzzled me at first until I realized his purpose. Holmes's disguises often began not with the face, but with the manner. He drew the bow across the strings, then adjusted his posture, adopting a slouch and a distracted air. Within moments he had transformed himself into a figure of shabby musicality, his keen intellect masked by the drooping lids and languid drawl of a street fiddler. "You will accompany me, Watson," he said briskly. "We shall call upon Covent Garden, where I believe our Mr. Felix is known. A man may vanish from his employer's theatre, but his habits cling to him like soot to a chimney. If he bought the chemicals for his concoctions, there will be a merchant who remembers him." It was near noon when we reached the bustle of Covent Garden. Stalls of flowers and fruit lined the square, and the cries of hawkers echoed beneath the glass roof of the market halls. Holmes, still in his fiddler's guise, sauntered ahead, idly scraping a tune that drew little more than scornful glances. I walked beside him as if in the role of his respectable companion, carrying myself with the indifference of one obliged to attend a poor relation. He paused before a chemist's shop tucked between a seller of perfumes and a stationer. Its window displayed an array of powders, tinctures, and exotic dyes, clearly catering as much to the stage as to apothecaries. Inside, the air was pungent with camphor and chamomile. A thin, nervous man behind the counter looked up as we entered. Holmes leaned his fiddle against the counter, scratching idly at his neck. "A pinch of colour for the chorus," he drawled in a voice utterly unlike his own. "Something to make the air shimmer, eh? Our painter swore by it. The fellow Felix, you'll know him." The chemist blinked, hesitated, then gave a quick, reluctant nod. "Mr. Felix? Yes. He was here not 3 days past, ordered another pound of the aniline preparation, most particular about the mix. A demanding gentleman." "And he paid well?" Holmes prompted. "Too well," the man confessed. "Cash in sovereigns, and he pressed for speed. Said he must have it for a spectacle. I told him the fumes were unwholesome, but he would have it." Holmes's expression did not change, though his eyes gleamed. "And where does one send such a parcel, friend?" The chemist lowered his voice. "Not to the Corinthian, sir. To a lodging-house off Wellington Street near the river. I recall it clearly, for he wrote the address with an impatient hand." He scribbled it upon a scrap of paper and handed it over. Holmes accepted it with a careless nod, as though the matter were of no importance, and shuffled toward the door. Once outside, however, his pace quickened, and he thrust the note into my hand. "There, Watson. A den by the river. It will serve either as refuge or as trap, but we must tread carefully. Felix is desperate, and a desperate man with chemicals is a dangerous foe." We hailed a cab and soon found ourselves in the narrow streets that huddled by the Thames. The lodging-house was a grim affair, leaning against its neighbour like a weary drunkard, its signboard half-rotted and its windows filmed with grime. Holmes discarded his disguise before we entered, standing once more in his own severe composure. The landlady, a broad-shouldered woman with a shrewd face, admitted us with suspicion, until Holmes produced a coin and explained that we sought her lodger Felix upon urgent business. At the sound of the name, her lips tightened. "He's not been back since yesterday evening," she said. "Left in a hurry, he did, and near knocked over my candlesticks in his flight. There's queer things in his room, smells like the devil's workshop. I want no trouble with the police." "You shall have none," Holmes assured her, and we were shown up a narrow stair. The room was small, its single window looking down toward the murky flow of the Thames. A table stood in the centre, littered with jars, brushes, and scraps of gauze similar to those in the paint room. But what drew Holmes's immediate attention was a leather case lying half open on the bed. Inside were instruments of a finer make than one would expect of a stage painter, a brass compass, delicate glass tubes, and a sheaf of papers covered with diagrams. Holmes spread them upon the table, his brow furrowing. The drawings depicted not stage scenery, but intricate arrangements of lights and signals, arrows pointing toward the river, and annotations in a cramped foreign hand. At the bottom of one page was a symbol I did not recognize, a circle bisected by a diagonal slash marked in scarlet ink. "Watson," Holmes said gravely, "this is no mere quarrel of theatre hands. We stand upon the edge of conspiracy. Our murdered man was not chosen at random. He was a message-bearer, or worse, a decoy. Felix is but an agent, and somewhere in London his master waits." As he spoke, a sudden knock rattled the door, 3 short raps, followed by a pause, then 2 more. Holmes's head snapped up, his eyes alight with that fierce energy I knew so well. He raised a finger for silence, then whispered, "Stay close, Watson. The next act of our drama begins." The knocks came again, sharp against the worn wood, and Holmes moved with the silence of a cat. He crossed the small room in 3 strides, pressing himself to the wall beside the door. His eyes flicked to me, commanding patience, though my hand had already gone instinctively to my cane, more out of habit than expectation of use. The knock was repeated in the same curious rhythm, 3, a pause, then 2. It was a signal, and Holmes's lips curved in a brief, knowing line. The door opened a fraction, and through the crack slid a hand gloved in black leather. A whisper followed, urgent and foreign, the words indistinct but quick. When no answer came, the hand pushed further, and the figure stepped in. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with a dark coat and hat low on his brow. He froze as he saw us. Holmes had already moved. With a swift motion, he shut the door behind the man and turned the key. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "We have been expecting you." The stranger's eyes narrowed, and in a flash he lunged for the table where the papers lay. Holmes intercepted him with surprising force, his wiry frame concealing a strength that belied appearances. The 2 men struggled briefly, and then the intruder, realizing the odds, went suddenly still. He straightened, his face half in shadow, and when he spoke, his accent betrayed a continental origin. "You have no right here," he hissed. "This is not your affair." "On the contrary," Holmes returned, adjusting his cuffs with maddening composure. A dead man by the river, crimson fog, and a frightened painter fleeing his lodgings. Such matters inevitably become my affair. Now, sir, will you enlighten us as to your purpose, or must I deduce it entirely? The man gave a contemptuous laugh, but said nothing. Holmes regarded him with cool detachment before lifting one of the sheets from the table. He held it up so the light fell across the scarlet mark at its base. "This symbol," Holmes said, "a circle and a slash. You will pardon my ignorance, but I find it appears not in chemistry nor in stagecraft. I would place it rather in the realm of societies, those secret gatherings where men swear oaths best left unspoken. Am I wrong?" The stranger's jaw tightened, though he betrayed himself by the flicker of unease in his eyes. Holmes's voice grew colder. "You came expecting Felix? You find instead his room ransacked, his tools examined, his secrets exposed. Shall I assume, then, that you were his master? Or are you merely another link in the chain, a courier sent to ensure obedience?" Still the man refused to answer. Lestrade, who had accompanied us but until now stood silent near the window, suddenly stepped forward with handcuffs at the ready. "We can let him explain at the yard, Mr. Holmes. A night in the cells loosens most tongues." But Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet, Inspector. If we seize him too quickly, the larger net may slip away. Let us try a different tack." He turned back to the man, his gaze cutting like a knife. "You sought Felix. That tells me he has failed in some task, and failure in your circle must be paid for dearly. Am I correct?" The stranger said nothing, but his silence was eloquent. Holmes leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Oh, then Felix has fled. He will run to the only place he believes himself safe. And you," he gestured at the man with a flick of his hand, "you will follow. That is why you are more valuable to me at liberty than in chains." Lestrade sputtered at this, but Holmes ignored him, unlocking the door with a decisive click. He bowed slightly as if to a guest. "Pray continue your errand. My colleague here will accompany you at a distance, though you will never know it. And if you should attempt violence, you will find Scotland Yard less forgiving than I." The man gave a dark, searching look, as though weighing whether Holmes spoke truth or bluff. Then, without another word, he swept up his hat and vanished down the stair. Holmes turned at once to Lestrade. "Two men outside. Shadow him. Do not lose sight, but do not approach. He will lead you either to Felix or to the one who commands them both." When Lestrade had dispatched his constables, Holmes turned to me, his eyes alight with that peculiar brilliance I had seen only when the game was at its most intricate. He gathered the papers swiftly, rolling them tight and binding them with twine. "Watson, we are close now," he said. "Do you not see the shape of it?" The crimson fog was no mere trick, it was a beacon. Our murdered man was forced into position, turned into a signal post for a vessel on the Thames. But the vessel was not random, nor was the signal for amusement. It was for recognition, an arranged rendezvous cloaked beneath the city's natural veil, and the man who died was either unwilling or unfit for the role. "And Felix?" I asked. Holmes placed the bundle into his coat. "Felix is the craftsman, but not the hand that writes the play. He obeys. The true author remains hidden, and it is him we must unmask. Yet we have made progress. The tailor will soon give us the name of our corpse, and once we know the man, we shall know what message he carried and for whom." As we left the lodging-house, the fog pressed thick once more, though now it seemed to me darker than before, charged with menace. Holmes walked briskly, his long coat flaring behind him, while I kept close, uneasy with the silence that clung to the streets. At last he spoke. "There is one further step tonight. The river must be watched. Our crimson beacon was meant to draw a craft. If that craft has not yet been warned away, it may attempt a second approach. We shall wait upon the embankment, Watson, and see if the tide brings us revelation or peril. So it was that we set our course back toward the Thames, the weight of conspiracy heavy upon us, and the knowledge that before the fog lifted, London itself might witness another shadow in the crimson mist. The Thames lay before us like a ribbon of black glass, its sluggish waters shifting under the weight of fog. Lanterns along the embankment glowed faintly, but the vapour pressed so thick that each lamp was no more than a dull circle suspended in gloom. Holmes strode with swift, silent purpose, his shoulders drawn and his eyes scanning the river as though it were a stage set for his private drama. I confess that I felt a creeping unease, for there was something unnatural in the silence that hung upon the air. Even the cries of watermen and the clatter of carts from the Strand seemed muted, absorbed by that heavy veil. Holmes led me to a stone archway overlooking the Adelphi stairs where the body had been found. He crouched at the edge, examining the damp stone with his lantern shaded in his hand. The place bore no new disturbance, but the faint traces of crimson, washed thin, yet still discernible, lingered on the rail and steps like a ghost of the fog we had witnessed the night before. Holmes ran his finger lightly across the stain and held it to the light. "It clings, Watson, even after rain and tide. This is not stage powder alone. It has been fixed with a binder to resist dispersal. That confirms it was no mere theatrical experiment, but a deliberate mark designed to endure long enough for recognition." He straightened, his keen profile sharp against the vapour. "And recognition implies a watcher, somewhere upon these waters, a pair of eyes strained to see that glow. Let us discover if the watcher returns." We concealed ourselves beneath the arch, where the stone cast a deeper shadow. Holmes crouched upon the steps, his gaze fixed steadily upon the river, while I kept watch upon the street above. Time passed slowly. The tide shifted with a hollow lap, and the fog seemed to thicken with every minute. Holmes remained utterly still, his breathing barely perceptible, his body tense with that curious vitality which seized him when the chase neared its climax. It was near midnight when Holmes's hand shot up suddenly a silent command. I strained my ears and at first heard nothing. Then came the faintest rhythm of oars, so muted it seemed more the pulse of the river than the work of men. A shape moved upon the water, darker than the fog about it, gliding with unnatural silence. The dull glow of a lantern flickered, shielded quickly, then shone again in 3 brief flashes. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "There, Watson," he whispered. "The signal returned. Mark the pattern. 3, pause, 2. It is the very knock we heard at Felix's room. This is their rendezvous." The boat drew nearer, its outline resolving into a long, narrow skiff, with 2 men bending at the oars, and a third seated sternward, cloaked heavily against the damp. Holmes motioned for silence, and we crouched lower in the shadows. The skiff came to rest against the steps where the crimson stain lingered. The cloaked figure rose slightly, scanning the fog, and gave a low whistle. Receiving no answer, he muttered something in a guttural accent and gestured impatiently to the oarsmen. They hesitated, then pulled back into the current, vanishing as soundlessly as they had come. Holmes exhaled softly, his eyes alight with triumph. "Do you see, Watson?" They expected a reply, an accomplice on shore. Felix's failure has disordered them, but they will not abandon their purpose after a single disappointment. They will seek another means, and that gives us our advantage. Even as he spoke, footsteps approached from the direction of the Strand. 2 constables emerged from the fog, led by Lestrade, his face pinched with cold and suspicion. He greeted us in a low voice, for Holmes raised a hand for silence. "You've seen something?" Lestrade asked. Holmes inclined his head. "A vessel at the very stairs, seeking a signal. They gave the same pattern we heard at Felix's lodgings." "You have your proof now, Inspector. The case is no longer confined to the corpse in the crimson fog. We have stumbled upon a communication across the Thames, one that smacks of conspiracy." Lestrade frowned. "Conspiracy, eh? Smuggling, perhaps? Or worse?" "Worse," Holmes said gravely. "Smugglers do not spend sovereigns on chemical dyes, nor employ actors to cloak their work. No, Inspector, this is political. That symbol we found upon Felix's papers belongs not to commerce, but to a clandestine society. I would hazard that the men in yonder skiff are but pawns like Felix. The true hand lies deeper, and it uses London's fog as cover for its messages." Lestrade gave a low whistle. "If you're right, Holmes, this is more than yard business. This is Foreign Office business." "Precisely," Holmes replied, "and that is why we must act with both speed and subtlety. If word leaks, our quarry will vanish before dawn." The inspector muttered something under his breath, but he deferred, as always, to Holmes's certainty. Holmes turned back to me, his eyes keen. "Watson, we must divide our forces. Lestrade will keep his men stationed here at the stairs. If the boat returns, they are to shadow it at distance, but not interfere. Meanwhile, we shall trace Felix's master by another route, through the identity of our dead man. The tailor's reply must be waiting upon Baker Street by now. His name will open the next door." So we left the embankment and made our way back across the sleeping city, the fog swirling about our cab like a shroud. Holmes was silent, his mind racing, his fingers drumming against his knee. When at last we reached Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson admitted us with a worried look and handed Holmes a sealed envelope that had arrived scarcely an hour before. Holmes broke it open at once, scanning the contents by the light of the lamp. A glint of satisfaction crossed his features. He passed the letter to me. It was brief, from a tailor in Savile Row, confirming that the suit we had described had been purchased 6 months prior by one Reginald Atherton, a barrister of some standing with chambers in Lincoln's Inn. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Then lies our victim, Watson, a barrister of the courts, outwardly respectable, yet found dead by the river in a crimson fog. The question now is, what cause linked a man of law to a painter of theatres and to a society that signals across the Thames at midnight? Until we answer that, London's mist will remain more crimson than grey." The fire crackled in the grate as the fog pressed close against the windows, and I felt, not for the first time, that the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for Holmes to tear away the veil that shrouded its darker secrets. Holmes studied the tailor's letter with a concentration so intense that I could hear the faint creak of the paper as his fingers pressed against it. He rose abruptly, began pacing before the fire, and spoke in a low, rapid voice as though the act of thinking aloud sharpened each deduction. "Reginald Atherton, barrister of Lincoln's Inn, a man of reputation, well turned out, accustomed to the theatre, and possessing the habits of one who mingles with society's fringes. He is found dead, his clothing neat, his body marked not by robbery, but by a symbolic performance in fog. Now, Watson, consider what cause could lead a man of law to be entangled with Felix and his powders, with foreign agents upon the river. It is too delicate to be coincidence. Atherton was either participant or pawn, and both are equally suggestive. I could not refrain from remarking that the man's chambers might provide the answer." Holmes's lips twitched in faint approval, though his eyes did not soften. Just so, but we must tread cautiously. If Atherton's death is known to his colleagues, the chambers may already be watched. If not, then his absence will soon rouse suspicion. Either way, time presses. Come, Watson, there is no hour too late when a clue is at stake. Within half an hour, we were in a cab rattling toward Lincoln's Inn. The fog still lay thick, though its colour was the familiar grey of dawn's earliest hours, rather than the sinister crimson. The streets were near empty, and the great gate of the inn loomed out of the mist like a fortress. A sleepy porter admitted us after Holmes murmured something about urgent legal business. His disguise of manner was astonishing. Within moments he was no longer the commanding detective, but a harried clerk, mumbling with the absent-minded air of one perpetually chasing deadlines. Atherton's chambers were on the second floor of a narrow block. Holmes produced his set of lockpicks with as much ceremony as another man might show in drawing a handkerchief, and within moments the door yielded. We entered a dim room lit only by the glow of embers in the grate. The air was heavy with the scent of stale tobacco, and papers long closed against dust. Holmes moved swiftly yet silently, his lantern beam darting across shelves stacked with briefs, boxes of correspondence, and legal tomes in sober bindings. At first it seemed a respectable barrister's office, nothing more. Yet Holmes's instinct seldom erred. He crouched before a filing cabinet, ran his finger along the dust at the handle, and muttered, "Not opened in weeks, but this drawer, see, Watson, the dust is disturbed." He drew it open and produced a leather folio bound with twine. Unfastening it, he revealed not legal arguments, but letters, written in a cramped foreign hand. Holmes scanned the first page, his lips tightening. He handed it to me without comment. The letter, though couched in vague phrases, clearly spoke of meetings at the river, the mark in the fog, and delivery of the signal to the vessel. One line stood stark: the circle must be drawn before the month wanes or the covenant fails. Holmes took the letter back and rifled through the rest. Several were signed with that same scarlet circle and slash mark we had found among Felix's papers. "So Atherton was no innocent victim," Holmes said grimly. "He was a correspondent, perhaps even a member of this society. Yet why then was he slain? Did he betray them? Did he falter in some duty?" A faint sound interrupted us, the creak of a stair. Holmes snapped the folio shut and extinguished the lantern, leaving us in near darkness, save the glow of the fire. We stood motionless. The door eased open and a beam of light from a bull's-eye lantern swept the chamber. A man stepped inside, cautious, his boots scarcely audible on the boards. Holmes sprang upon him with the swiftness of a striking hawk, wrenching the lantern from his grasp and forcing him into the light. It was Felix. His face was gaunt, his hair wild, his eyes darting with the desperation of a man driven to his last resort. He struggled briefly, but Holmes's grip was iron. At last he sagged, panting. "So, Felix," Holmes said coldly, "we meet again, though not upon your chosen stage. You come here in the dead of night. Was it to recover these letters, perhaps, or to destroy them?" Felix's gaze flickered to the folio upon the desk, and that alone was answer enough. Holmes pressed him into a chair. "Speak, man. What covenant is this? Why did your masters slay Reginald Atherton in such a manner?" For a moment, Felix was silent, his lips pressed tight, but at last the words burst forth in a low, trembling rush. "I did not strike the blow. I painted only what I was told. They said the fog must be crimson, that the man must stand at the stair as a signal to the boat." Atherton agreed, but then he faltered. He would not go through with it. They feared exposure. They ordered me to hold him, and when he struggled, when he cried out, the cord was used. Holmes's eyes blazed. "Who gave the order?" Felix shook his head violently. I never saw his face. He came cloaked, spoke little, and bore always the mark, the circle. I am but a tool. Do with me what you will, but I cannot name him. Holmes regarded him in silence, and I knew he weighed every inflection, every tremor. At last he said, "You will come with us to Scotland Yard. There you will give your account under oath. Whether you are pawn or player, your role in this plot is finished." Felix bowed his head, defeated. As we left the chambers with our prisoner in tow, the first light of dawn filtered dimly through the fog, though it did little to lift the gloom of the streets. Holmes walked swiftly, his face grave, the folio of letters under his arm. "Watson," he said, "we have moved beyond murder into treason. Atherton was no mere barrister, but a conspirator. His death was not the end of the play, but only the opening act. The circle they serve has not yet closed, and until it does, London stands upon the brink of peril." I shivered at his words, and as the bells of St. Clement Danes tolled the hour, I felt that their solemn notes carried not only across the fog, but deep into the heart of a mystery that had only begun to unfold. Lestrade received us at the yard with a mixture of triumph and suspicion, for Felix, gaunt and broken, was thrust into the inspector's custody like a trophy dragged from the shadows of London. Yet Holmes, rather than bask in victory, pressed no hand of congratulation. He stood by the iron bars as Felix was secured in the holding cell, his eyes intent upon the man's twitching hands and restless gaze. When Lestrade turned the key and straightened, Holmes said quietly, "Guard him well, Inspector. You have a frightened creature here, but fear is as dangerous as malice. If his masters believe him compromised, he will not live to see another dawn." Lestrade scoffed at the suggestion, though his expression betrayed unease. "He'll be safe enough. Walls and watchmen are thick here, Holmes." "Walls," Holmes replied, "are of little use when treachery eats at them from within. Remember my words." With that, he left the yard, beckoning me to follow. The morning air was bitter and damp, though the fog had begun at last to thin into ragged veils. Holmes strode quickly, his long stride carrying us back toward Baker Street before I had gathered my thoughts. At last, I asked what pressed so heavily upon his mind. "Watson," he said, his voice taut with suppressed urgency, "we now hold the threads of a design larger than a single murder. Atherton was not merely a barrister, but a conduit, a man of law corrupted into service for this society of the circle. Felix was the craftsman painting their signals, but neither held the command. The one who ordered Atherton's death remains cloaked, and he has not abandoned his design. Those letters speak of a covenant, of a date before the month wanes. That gives us only days, perhaps hours. We must act before the circle completes itself." Once at Baker Street, Holmes spread the folio of letters across the table. He arranged them not by sequence of date, but by the placement of the scarlet symbol at the bottom of each. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how the mark shifts. In some letters it leans left, in others right. A mere flourish? No, it is a cipher. By its direction and angle, the writer conveys detail too dangerous to set in words. Here, see, this stroke indicates a location, and this a time. With enough samples, we may reconstruct their design." For an hour he worked, silent, save for the occasional murmur. He compared the scarlet marks with a map of the Thames, measured their angles with a compass, and at last drew a line across the chart. His hand trembled with suppressed excitement. "Watson, do you recall the boat that came to the stairs? They sought a signal, 3 flashes, they will come again. These letters point not to the Adelphi alone, but to 3 sites along the river. When connected, they form a triangle, a geometry that encloses a space between Westminster and Blackfriars, and what lies within that triangle?" I bent over the map. The Houses of Parliament. Precisely. Holmes's voice was hard as flint. Atherton's society plots nothing less than an act at the very heart of government. The fog, the signals, the boat, they are but the outer trappings. Within days, Watson, unless we move swiftly, some dire scheme will unfold upon that space. I confess that my blood chilled at his words. Yet Holmes gave me no time for reflection. He swept the papers into his coat, seized his hat, and summoned a cab. "To Westminster," he ordered. "We must see if our crimson fog is already creeping near the seat of power." The great river opened before us, broad and sluggish beneath the lifting mist. The towers of Parliament loomed spectral against the pale sky. Holmes directed the cab along the embankment, his eyes scanning the water. Presently he bade me halt and follow him on foot. We descended a stair to a landing stage used by river police, where a solitary officer saluted Holmes with recognition, for his fame had long since reached every branch of service. Holmes spoke rapidly to the man, inquiring after unusual movements on the water. The officer hesitated, then said, "A skiff passed here 2 nights running, sir. Silent as death, hugging the shadows. Last night?" They paused midstream, as if waiting for a sign from the shore. I thought it queer, but the fog was thick and I could not pursue. Holmes nodded grimly. "You saw the watchers, Watson? They circle the triangle already. The Covenant draws near. Tonight, or the night after, they will attempt their play." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes flung himself into his chair, fingers steepled, eyes closed. He remained so long in silence that I feared exhaustion had at last overtaken him. But when he spoke, it was with startling clarity. "We must anticipate them. The crimson fog is their instrument. Its colour marks their meeting point. They will release it again, nearer Parliament, to guide their confederates. Felix's powders are the key. With the proper preparation, we may reproduce their signal, but at a place and time of our choosing. Then we may draw the spider from its web." I stared at him, scarcely believing. "You mean to set a trap, become yourself the beacon?" Holmes's eyes opened, glittering with fierce resolve. "Exactly. They believe Felix still serves them. When they see the crimson bloom where they expect it not, they will come, certain their plot proceeds. And there we shall be waiting, but it must be precise, Watson. One misstep, and the circle will vanish into the night." At that moment, a sharp rap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, pale and flustered, carrying a message delivered by hand. Holmes tore it open. As he read, the lines of his face hardened. "It is as I feared," he said. "Felix is dead, strangled in his cell not half an hour ago." The horror of it struck me dumb. Lestrade's words at the yard, his assurance of safety, rang bitter in my ears. Holmes rose swiftly, his face set like iron. "The circle wastes no time silencing its pawns. They believe themselves untouchable. Very well. Tonight, Watson, we shall answer them with their own weapon. The crimson fog will rise again, but it will not be their triumph. It will be their undoing." The firelight flickered across his sharp features, and I saw in that moment the terrible brilliance of his mind burning against the encroaching shadow. The game had entered its final movement, and though the city slept in ignorance, Holmes and I knew that London's fate might be decided before another dawn broke across the Thames. Night fell, and the fog returned. Holmes worked without flourish. On the table lay a small brazier, a tin of crimson powder from Felix's recipe, and wicks soaked in a binding solution. He measured each pinch with a chemist's care. "Remember the positions," he said. "The triangle closes on Parliament. We light it from the angle they do not expect, the Lambeth Bank, opposite the clock. Lestrade has men on the water. When our beacon rises, their skiff will approach. Do not show yourself until I give the word." We set out before midnight. The streets were near deserted. At the embankment, Holmes dismissed the driver and led me down a stair to a landing screened by a jut of wall. He arranged the apparatus swiftly, brazier behind a crate, charged wicks in a bowl, a shaded lantern to his left. He struck the spark, fed it, then looked to the river. At his nod, I opened the tin. Holmes touched a wick to the coal and held it at shoulder height. The air bloomed, a soft red that stained the vapour. Another wick deepened the hue, a third washed the mist to old claret. From the water came the faint hiss of oars. Holmes cupped the lantern and flashed 3 brief shields. A pause, then 2. We waited. Presently, a skiff cut from beneath Westminster Bridge. 2 oarsmen bent low, a third crouched in the stern and guided them toward our landing. "Stand where you are," Holmes whispered. "They expect 1 man on shore. Let them step into the noose." The skiff touched with the faintest knock. The stern man rose, short and cloaked, hat brim low. "The covenant," he said. "The seal is set." His English was precise. Holmes did not take it. "Your circle is broken," he answered. "You strangled your painter, you lost your barrister. Tonight you lose your boat." The man's head tipped a fraction. Holmes's whistle shrilled. From the river to our right a police launch surged. From the left another shadow detached, bearing Lestrade. The oarsman lunged to push off, but Holmes had already cast a line. The fine cord from Felix's coat tightened, catching the skiff by the thwart and yanking it hard against the stone. The cloaked man's hand went to his sleeve. Metal flashed. I sprang forward. Holmes was quicker. He struck the wrist with his cane. A small pistol clattered into the river. "Alive, if you please," Holmes said to Lestrade. "We require a confession, and the Foreign Office a name." The inspector hauled the man ashore. A gust lifted the cloak's edge, and the lantern struck a pale, composed face, clean-shaven, severe. "You play well," he said, "but you do not know the tune." Holmes's eyes were like ice. "On the contrary, you meant to raise a crimson veil while your friends slipped a packet by water to a window you had arranged to be opened. Atherton was to stand as guarantee. When he failed, you killed him and kept the hour." He pointed to the skiff. The packet. Lestrade overturned a locker. Wrapped in oilskin lay a flat tin sealed with red wax, impressed with the circle and slash. Holmes weighed it, then gave it to Lestrade. "To the yard, unopened. Telegraph Whitehall." We bound the oarsmen and signalled the launches. Holmes doused the brazier and kicked the cooled ash into the Thames. The crimson bled from the fog as if a hand had wiped the sky. Then he turned back to our prisoner. "Your name," he said. The man smiled faintly. "Names are smoke." "Then offices," Holmes murmured. "You are a clerk of the War Department, or close enough to touch its files. You chose Atherton because a barrister crosses doors that defeat a sailor. You met Felix at the Corinthian because a paint room buys discretion. You arranged the river because water keeps a secret better than stone." No change crossed the man's face. His gloved fingers tightened, the only betrayal. Lestrade swore. "We'll have your particulars at the yard." Holmes inclined his head. "We shall have more than that. We shall have the contents of your tin and Atherton's letters side by side, cipher against cipher." He glanced toward the Palace of Westminster. "You chose this night poorly, the fog remembers." By 2:00 our launches nosed upstream. Holmes sat in the stern beside me. "You were certain they would come," I said. "I was certain of their need," he answered. "Plots miscarry from pride, not caution. They believed themselves invisible because they hired the air as accomplice, but even air leaves traces, odour, colour, a song in a tightened string. He touched his pocket where the rescued cord lay coiled. Men rehearse in theatres and forget the audience may include a detective. On the quay, Lestrade clapped orders. The prisoner was led away without resistance. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me with a smile. "Sleep, Watson?" he asked. "After this?" I laughed. "Not until I hear the tune entire." "Then we shall play it at Whitehall," said he. "And hope, for London's sake, that the final bar is not in a minor key." The following morning the air was clear at last, the sun striking off the river as though it meant to banish the memory of crimson fog. Holmes, weary but unsleeping, sat with Lestrade and myself in a private chamber at Whitehall. The tin, opened under official seal, lay upon the table. Within were not jewels or coin, but sheets of ciphered documents, plans of naval positions, coded correspondences with foreign agents, and a schedule of intended meetings disguised as innocuous theatre programs. The officials present, grim men of the Foreign Office, spoke little but nodded with grave satisfaction. They confirmed Holmes's deductions. Atherton had indeed betrayed his country, a barrister with access to privileged documents who passed them through the circle. Felix had provided the means, the fog and signal, while the cloaked figure, the clerk Holmes had unmasked, was their conduit to the enemy across the Channel. The crimson fog had been their method of exchange, a false lantern in the night, a theatrical flourish masking treason. Holmes explained the affair in his customary calm, reconstructing each step with clarity that left no room for doubt. He spoke of the bruise on Atherton's neck, the violet perfume masking chemical binders, the torn scrap of paper that revealed the cipher, and the crimson gauze that turned London's mist into a beacon. Each triviality, dismissed by others, had been fitted by Holmes into a chain of logic as precise as any mechanism. When he finished, the silence in the chamber was heavy with both admiration and unease. One of the officials said only, "England owes you much, Mr. Holmes." When we returned to Baker Street, the weight of the case seemed to lift at last. Holmes dropped into his chair, reached for his violin, and drew a few languid notes that trembled gently in the air. I could not help but remark upon the peril we had skirted, and how near London had come to becoming the unwitting stage for conspiracy. Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes half closed. "Peril, my dear Watson, is but the shadow cast by complacency. Men blind themselves with fog and call it safety. But if one looks closely enough, the mist conceals no more than it reveals. The danger lay not in the colour of the air, but in our willingness to ignore its hue." "And Atherton?" I asked quietly. Holmes set down his bow. "A man who sold his honour and paid the price. His brilliance in law made him dangerous. His vanity made him weak. The circle used him as one uses a pawn, and when he faltered, they cut him away. It is the eternal truth of conspiracies, Watson. They devour their own." The fire burned low, the room filled with the warm glow of familiar safety. I sat back, reflecting upon the strange path we had followed, from a corpse at the river stairs, through a theatre's paint room and a barrister's chamber, to the heart of London's power. Each clue, baffling in isolation, had yielded to Holmes's relentless logic until the entire web stood clear. At last Holmes leaned back, his eyes softening, the faintest humour at the corner of his lips. "You perceive, Watson, how easily crimson fog may be made of common dye and a little theatre dust. Men cloak their crimes in such disguises, hoping the world will mistake them for mysteries. Yet there is always a thread if one only stoops to find it." I could not help but smile. "And you, Holmes, are always the one to stoop." He inclined his head in acknowledgment, then set bow to string once more. The gentle melody filled the sitting room, banishing the memory of crimson fog, and I marvelled yet again at the strange genius of my companion, who could pierce plots of treachery with the same ease that he drew music from a violin, leaving me as ever both humbled and grateful to have stood beside him in the adventure of Sherlock Holmes and the murder in the crimson fog.